So I introduced this bill, and here's what it said. If you have a disabled vet in your home and you are caring for that vet so they can stay home, if you're a member of the family, spouse, parent, we're going to help you. And we said we'd give you 3 different ways we could help you. One is we would give to the family member nurses training so they know medically what they could do to make sure that that vet stayed healthy in home. Secondly, we give you a break called respite care. Up to 2 weeks a year, we'll send in a visiting nurse so that you can have some time of your own. These folks that spend 52 weeks a year caring for disabled vets sometimes need a break. And the third thing we said, if you have an economic hardship in your home, we will pay you a stipend for keeping your vet at home and helping them. And the amount of money in the stipend is between $600 and $3,000 a month. So it isn't a huge amount of money, but it turns out to be a significant amount of money. When we first proposed this bill, there was some question about who would be covered, who would be protected. So the VA said, all right, we'll go along with this as long as you just help the disabled vets that incurred their injuries after 9/11/2001. And so we did. We said, we'll take that. And initially we thought there would be 4,000 or 5,000 of them who would be involved. The number today is 20,000 nationwide, disabled vets who are getting help through the caregiver program. The obvious injustice in this is the fact that there are many vets who were injured before 9/11/2001 that need the same helping hand at home. And so I'm introducing today with Senator Baldwin of Wisconsin a bill that extends the caregivers programs to all vets who could be eligible for this kind of care. Let me read you a couple things which I think tell the story pretty quickly. One of them is about a vet who returned named Trish Sylvester. Trish is married to Dan Sylvester. Trish is from Chicago, veteran of the Iraq War, 100% disabled by PTSD. That PTSD can be triggered from anything from a backfiring car to simply a bad day. Dan, her husband, veteran himself, graduated from DePaul Law School last year, practices law part-time. As he did all through law school, Dan takes care of his wife, Trish, who's suffering from this terrible PTSD situation. He makes sure she takes her medications and gets help when she needs it. Trish's symptoms first took hold in February 2011. She's been hospitalized many, many times. The Sylvesters found out about this family caregiver program shortly after it was launched and applied for help through the Jesse Brown VA Hospital, which many of you know, in Chicago. They used the caregiver stipend to pay for counseling services that aren't covered by the VA. The money also helped them avoid taking out more student loans so they didn't go any deeper in debt. Dan says if it wasn't for the resources in this program, Trish would have to be hospitalized. What does it mean to be hospitalized in terms of cost? Just to give you an idea, if the VA decides that a disabled vet has no other place to go but a nursing home, it costs the federal government $332,000 a year for each vet to go to a nursing home. If they decide instead that they're going to put them in a community nursing home, it's $88,000 a year. If they are in a state veterans home like the one we have over in Quincy, it's about $45,000 a year. The caregivers program maximum stipend is $36,000 a year, and many families are getting less. So strictly from a dollar viewpoint, this makes sense. But as you get to meet these families, and you know some of them, I'm sure, as you get to meet these families, you understand what's really important here. These vets want to be home. They want to be with their families. They do better when they're at home, and they progress, and they have a life, and they're part of the family. So it isn't just a matter of dollars and cents. It's a matter of doing the right thing. Our obligations to our vets don't end after they come home. Our obligations continue. A number of you have come up to me here who are still carrying with you some of the scars of conflict. So I'm going to introduce this bill to extend this Veterans Caregivers Program. Somebody will say, well, it's going to cost some money. It will, and it should, and we should pay it. And we should understand that it's a small price to pay for vets who come home disabled. I went through the Hines VA hospital up in Chicago, and I saw a poor fella in a bed, paralyzed, and I said, how long you been here? He said, I served in Vietnam. Can you imagine? If that poor man could have been home with his family during this period of time, his life would have been so much better. And that's what this program is all about. Don't want to take anything away from the VA and the good work they do, but if that veteran could be at home, let's do our best to make sure they can stay. Let me acknowledge two other people before I take any questions. VFW Post Commander Donald Taylor. Donald, where are you? He did? Okay. How about Quartermaster Oscar Kowalski? He was here earlier too. So let me open it up to any questions. Any of my friends here want to say a word from the vets? You're welcome to.
Go ahead,
Terry, you want to say a word?
No, I'll talk when Terry.
No, that's right. Well, thank you, Senator, for an opportunity to address this.
Tell them who you're again.
Terry Vance, I'm the state adjutant, quartermaster, past state commander of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. I am happy that the senator and his leadership proposing this. Certainly, the veterans that I represent or have an opportunity to represent, over 70,000 here in Illinois, certainly support this. Also, our national organization, we just returned from Washington, D.C. before the snowfall, and the American Legion and the National Veterans of Foreign Wars and AMVETS and DAV are on board in supporting him. So we're just happy for your leadership and happy to support this because it's the right thing to do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Terry. Give your seat back. Mike?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Walton. I'm a past commander of Springfield Post 32, the American Legion, very involved on the national level of the American Legion also. And I echo what Adjutant Terry had to say. American Legion is 100% behind this. Nationwide, it's the right thing to do. We're very fortunate in Illinois to have Senator Durbin. This man is always on the veterans' side. He always has been from day one. I remember when he was back in the state legislature years ago, and I had hair at the time, but he's always been the friend of the veteran, and the veterans of Illinois appreciate Dick Durbin. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And a miracle has happened. There's a candidate who doesn't want to say anything, but Joe McMenamin, thank you, buddy, for being here. Appreciate it. Answer any questions you all might have.
Senator, what is the price tag for this expansion?
You know, Jim, you can't tell in front what it's going to cost because some of these caregivers don't ask for any money. Some ask for and receive up $600 and some up to $3,000. But we think they're estimated some 88,000 who are currently not being cared for. I shouldn't say that, not part of our program. 20,000 in, 88,000 not in. So I could give you just a wild estimate, but that's all it would be at this point.
Senator, did you say it would it be $3,000? How much of a stipend would it cost?
The maximum is $3,000 a month.
So, as compared to spending $330,000
for a nursing home.
in a nursing home,
That's right.
I think the government would save money.
Well, of course, and some veterans cannot stay at home. They don't have a family member who can take on this responsibility. So I don't want to in any way denigrate the nursing homes and other care facilities, even our state nursing facilities, veterans homes. But where they can and where they want to, we want those veterans to have a chance to stay at home, and it saves us money.
Senator, was there a certain instance that made you think we need to expand beyond the post 9/11 care? There's something that stood out, like, we need to go retroactive with this?
Well, I thought about this at the time. We initially wanted to cover everybody, so it would have been over 100,000. And the VA said, well, we're just due post 9/11. They thought only 4,000 would participate, 20,000 have. So there was a real need out there. That's the first thing that came across. And to be quite blunt with you, I happened to have grown up in the Vietnam era. I did not serve. But when I ran into that paralyzed vet in that Hines VA hospital and thought, this poor man has been in this room, in this bed for decades. I thought to myself, maybe there was no other place for him to go. But if it were possible for him to be home with a little helping hand from our government, that's the right thing to do.
Will you reach across the aisle with somebody like Senator McCain and try and get support?
I will, and John might join me on this. I haven't asked him directly, but this passed overwhelmingly bipartisan, the original bill, and I hope this extension will too.
Senator, why was the VA hesitant to take all veterans? Why did they want just post 9/11?
They were afraid of the cost, and they didn't know what would be involved. But I think the popularity of this program has really surprised them, and the need for it has surprised them. So they've learned in the process this is the right thing to do. It's from a cost viewpoint, cost-efficient thing to do.
What's the criteria? Is this only for veterans who are disabled in the line of duty and in a war and conflict?
They have to be categorized as disabled to qualify. And as any of these folks here can tell you, that is a long, tough process, and a lot of folks don't get it. And so the level determination of disability makes them eligible for the program.
But the disability be combat related or service related, or?
Jim, you're pushing me. I think it is service related, and I can't go beyond that. I think that's as far as service, Mike, Terry? Service
But
related.
it could be service even domestically as opposed to service?
Yes, and you know, there are service-connected disabilities of those who are injured in training, you know, and they need the same protections.
As a follow-up to Jim, are there categories? I mean, how do we define who's able to get this, or how badly, in other words, how bad a shape do you have to be? Some people will say you're going to have people who are gaming the system.
No, well,
Have their wife get paid $3,000.
I hope that a lot of people don't say that, because I don't think that that's a problem, and we're going to be careful that it isn't abused.
Categories though written into
I think we're talking about 100% disability before you're eligible for this. So, you know, no matter what laws you write, somebody's going to try to find a way to get around them. But by and large, I've never questioned the ones that I've met. I don't think anyone would. I've run into some families. It was a fellow family I got to know, the Simones up in Will County. He was a helicopter pilot for the Air Force, shot down. 2 survived out of his crew, himself and 1 other. Terrible head injuries and difficulty with his mobility, but he got to go home and with his wife and his son, and they've had a new baby. And he is a happy man, and his wife, Andrea, has just told me over and over, we couldn't have done it without this program.
I'm sorry, just to follow up on my earlier question too, does this only pertain to injuries that happen during a time when we're in conflict? If someone's injured, say, between Vietnam and Gulf War I, would they be eligible?
We're redefining that. From my point of view, all disability, the 100% disabilities are going to be covered.
Will this include physical or mental disabilities, mental illness?
Well, I gave an example here on PTSD, where it can be so debilitating that they need constant care. It's hard unless you see it to realize the gravity of that injury. And it also is important for us to remember that it wasn't until fairly recently that we started acknowledging PTSD. You know, there was a scene I've told you before, if you saw the movie Patton, where he walked into a field hospital and said to the soldier, "What's wrong with you?" And he said, "My nerves are shot." And he reached down and slapped him and said, "Get back with your unit." And that used to be the way it was treated, sadly. And a lot of people went through a lot of grief because of that. So we've come a long, long way.
You used to call it
Senator,
Shell shock, battle fatigue.
more veterans, it appears, at least we hear, come from the smaller towns, that the factory shut down a few decades ago, and counties without a lot of resources. Being the cash-strapped counties, and areas, does that make that more important to have this kind of federal umbrella?
Well, think about the alternative. If that vet couldn't stay home and ended up at some care facility, as good as it might be, far away from his family, that really is not what any of us want to see happen. So if we can find a way, and I've run into some of the, there's a mother who's helping her son over near Champaign, in the rural areas, and she just said, "I don't know what I'd do. I don't know where he'd be. Maybe Danville or somewhere, and I just wouldn't get to see him." So this is an opportunity to keep him at home near the family.
Will you have proposed any offsets to cover any cost for this?
So far, Jim, we've not run into that. Most Democrats and Republicans think when it comes to the veteran side of this thing, we're going to pay what we need to pay. You know, I was talking, Gene over here served in the Navy, and we're talking about exposure to Agent Orange and what that might mean. And what we've done is to expand the treatment in VA to all these categories. It was a few years ago we went after homeless veterans. Why in the world would 500,000 homeless people be veterans in the United States of America? And they started bringing them in and examining them, and they found that they were suffering from 5 issues, each of these homeless veterans. One of these 5 issues or more. And depression, pain, insomnia problems that they were dealing with, and things, it turns out, that can be treated. So now we're bringing them into the system. So the point I'm getting to is we've kind of just said we're going to do it. We made the promise to the veterans and we're going to do it. And the argument that we just don't have enough money, honestly, we made that promise. We got to keep it.
Do you think this, Senator, do you think this is crucial to maintaining an all-volunteer army? I mean, young people hear these stories and they hear, well, if I go out and get injured, I may not be cared for, I may have to go off to an institution far from home. Is this something that maybe you think long-term is a concern in that regard?
I think it helps. You know, it's still a matter of personal courage for any individual to volunteer, not knowing what lies ahead, the dangers that they might face. But they all ought to know that regardless of what happens to them, we're going to keep our promise. You get hurt, serving our country, put your life on the line, we're going to be there when you come home.
Senator, what was this Mark Kirk, Senator Kirk, suffered a stroke? Was a stroke, or would it have to again be tied to service?
Well, I'm going to let Mark speak for himself, but his was not service connected.
So it would have to be service.
Yes, it would have to be.
Can we ask a couple of other topics? real
Sure,
quickly as well?
of course.
The Prime Minister Netanyahu, his remarks this week, and I guess the underlying theme is Iran can't be trusted. Why should Iran be trusted?
Well, it was Ronald Reagan, whom this Democrat will quote, who said, trust but verify. And I think it applies to this situation. Any agreement that we reach with Iran, if we reach one, needs to be verified and watched closely. They are a terrorist nation. They have been our enemy. They've been responsible for the deaths of innocent Americans, including the Marines in the barracks in Beirut. So, you know, I come to this with the understanding that we don't take their word for it. We've got to have a means of verification. Now let's get down to the bottom line. We're trying to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, not only because they could use it to harm their neighbors, but innocent countries around the world. And secondly, when they get a nuclear weapon, the arms race is on in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, right behind them. United Arab Republics, right behind them. So then we're facing an escalation of the possibility of terrorism and extremism to the ultimate. So we need to stop them from doing it. If we cannot achieve this with an agreement, the alternative is going to be military. And Israel, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said the other day, is prepared to go in.
You recently issued a press release on a report on the conditions of solitary confinement.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what you plan to do on improving those conditions in Illinois?
I started reading about this several years ago. And this is at the federal level, but it applies to states as well. It turns out that if you put a prisoner in jail, wherever the jail is, into an isolated, segregated situation, where they're in their cells for 23 hours with no other person in contact with them, and out for 1 hour walking around, over a long period of time, understandably, it has a negative impact on that person's mental health. So what we've said is, let's take an honest look at this. 95% of the people who go to prison end up out of prison someday. And if you turn a person out who's been damaged mentally by this segregation, then it's a risk to everybody else outside once they're released. I went down to Tams, Illinois. Some of you may have heard of it. We had the maximum security prison down at Tams, and they were keeping prisoners in isolation. And I said, take me to the most dangerous cell block at Tams. They took me in there, and I met 5 men who were in this segregation, solitary confinement situation. And I spoke to each one of them. And one man I walked up to, and I talked to him. You would have said right off the bat, I'll bet he's probably a college professor. Looks like a well-dressed, nice young man, so forth. And I said to him, what are you in for? He said, I was originally in for 50 years, but now I'm in for 100. And I said, what happened? He said, I told them if they put anybody in the cell with me, I'd kill them, and I did. So I come into this with my eyes wide open. There are some people that need to be in segregation. You would never put that man in the general prison population. But what we've tried to do at the federal level is to use this carefully and wisely and monitor it. So we have a report that just came out of the Bureau of Prisons, which I asked for, and they need more help in monitoring these prisoners to make sure they don't go over the edge into a mental state that could be dangerous to them or others.
Senator, can I have 2 questions and let me blend subject. One, I presume that you rejected Prime Minister Netanyahu's arguments that he made before Congress. I'd like to understand why you take the opposing view. But first on the VA, since we have heard so many horrific stories of the care at the VA hospitals, do you have any updated information as far as the Secretary's efforts to improve those conditions and to what extent? Where do we stand now?
I hear good reports. I believe it's Secretary McDonald, I think I got the name correctly, who is from Illinois. And I've met with him in Chicago at the veterans hospitals, and they're making changes. Part of the problem is that we have expanded the VA population. I mentioned homeless vets. We said that if you have any of 9 medical conditions and you were exposed to Agent Orange, we will treat them. We extended the coverage of PTSD back to every vet who ever served. So we dramatically expanded the population coming into veterans clinics and hospitals. It overwhelmed the system, and at that point, terrible things happened. They started falsifying waiting lists and falsifying the times on these veterans, and that was the scandal that led to the new secretary. So my impression is that they are moving in the right direction to provide more care for these veterans. But going back to Jim's question, it's expensive, costs a lot of money, but we've made that commitment, we've got to keep it.
And on the Prime Minister's argument that this is a bad deal, what we need is a better deal.
Well, my problem with the Prime Minister's statement about being a bad deal is the deal has not been announced. For goodness sakes. Well, I'm sure they keep him up to speed, but no final deal will be announced, even the preliminary part of it, until March 24th. And he's already dismissed it. The problem we have here is the notion that if we can't reach an agreement that we can enforce with Iran, there's going to be military action. I don't see a lot of Americans raising their hands saying, let's invade another Muslim nation. You know, we know what the cost is, and many of our families know better than any. So I want to be careful that we have done everything possible to stop a nuclear Iran and not involve us in another war.
What would you say about just the argument, not about the military, but that we raised the, can't be the term, not the embargo.
Sanctions?
The sanctions against them so that we have the ability to basically bring their economy to its knees, that we don't have to take military action.
Sanctions are a good tool, short of war. I support them. We've done it pretty well to the point where they've come to the negotiating table. Whether we can stop them cold with sanctions so they won't go forward on a nuclear program remains to be seen. I hope we can reach an agreement that involves inspection that we can trust.
Secretary Clinton's emails, are these going to pose a problem for her, or do you think there's any smoking gun in there anywhere?
Well, the report this morning is she called on the department to release them all, and that's the right thing to do. I don't know the circumstances. I will tell you that many people in my business try to take care to have an email system that is not official, so they can communicate on personal and political things. You shouldn't use computers of the government for political purposes. That's pretty obvious. So what she's trying to do, I believe, although she's not explained it at this point, was to avoid that possibility. So now she said disclose those emails, and we'll see what's in them.
You don't think there was any attempt to evade by having her official correspondence from this?
No, because I know many members of Congress that do exactly what I just described to you.
You have a bill mentioning laundry detergent and making it less appealing for children.
Yeah.
What is the importance of that?
Well, the importance was that I had a doctor from the National Poison Control Center in Chicago come see me in Washington. And he said to me, do you realize that last year we had thousands of children who picked up these laundry pods, you know, those little plastic packages, bit into them thinking they were candy because they're brightly colored, and ended up with those toxic chemicals in their mouth and inhaling them, and 1,300 of them ended up in the emergency room, and 1 out of 10 ended up on ventilators to keep them alive. So what we've said is, if you're going to put things in packages and try to make them child-proof, why wouldn't you include these packages, which are so dangerous and threatening to kids? So I've written to the companies involved and asked them to do it, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission. I'm not an industrial designer, but it would seem to me you could put a Ziploc on a bag that a kid would have a tough time opening. You could put a warning so mom knows that this should be put up on the highest shelf. And finally, here's something, what do I know as a lawyer? Couldn't you put a flavoring on the outside of that package that the kid would want to spit out of its mouth as fast as they could? You know, that strikes me as pretty obvious. You know, what?
Put vegetables on
Or answer vegetables or Tabasco or something, you know?
Do you support granting the president trade promotion authority?
We're going to have to wait and see what he comes up with because they're supposed to put some conditions on it. Here's what it comes down to. Trade promotion authority says this president, any president, for the period that it covers, can offer a trade agreement to Congress. Congress can only vote yes or no, can't change it, and can only do it by majority vote. So basically Congress is giving to a president, whoever, more authority to enter into a trade agreement with fewer questions being asked. I voted against it last time it came up in 2002. I thought it was too much. There are parts of the trade agreement that I want to know more about before I'm just going to give a blank check to a president when it comes to trade agreements. So we're going to wait and see. He's good.
Does not having TPA then not allow your chief trade negotiators to go in and bargain better with
Their argument is if we have to bargain with 535 members of Congress and these countries, we'll never get it done. So I want to see what he comes back with. If he has a middle ground there that protects certain areas. I'll give you an example. They have an alternative dispute mechanism that they're proposing in this trade agreement. What does that mean? That means that if we enter into an agreement with Malaysia, which I believe is one of the countries in TPP, and Malaysia says, we think that the laws in the United States which prohibit certain toxic chemicals or violate the trade agreement, and we're going to have our decision on that tested, not in the courts in the United States, but by a group of owners of businesses sitting around a table, I think it goes too far. So let's see what they propose as part of TPA.
Senator, on another trade-related, the rebuilding of our locks and dams a word ago seems to make perfect economic sense, not only for Illinois, but for 7 states or so, all the billions of dollars of trade going on in Mississippi. Where do we stand as far as just getting these locks and dams that are crumbling rebuilt?
Nobody quarrels with what you said. These locks and dams are decades old and many of them are falling apart. And Congress said, let's authorize the money to do it. And we've authorized it, and I voted for it, proudly announced it in a press release. There's only one step left, coming up with the money. And at this point, we don't have it. So unless we can come up with a revenue source that will pay for these locks and dams, user fees, perhaps, unless we can come up with a revenue source, we can authorize all we want. But whether it's a highway or an airport or a dam or a lock, you need the money to make it work.
People would say we borrow billions now to fund our deficit. Why don't we borrow to build these locks and dams that make money and then maybe charge a user fee after?
I'm all for infrastructure investment. But I will just tell you that there are laws written that make it difficult to incur a deficit and to increase a deficit, even though we have one. It's been going down, and we want to keep it going down. But I, for one, think an infrastructure investment, whether it's a highway or an airport or a bridge or a lock and a dam, is good to build the economy. And if there's one thing the government needs to do, it's to build that infrastructure. So I'm open. If there's I'll bet you do. I'm open to user fees or other revenue sources.
Matt Hart with the Truckers Association said they would be in favor, and he thinks other trucking firms, of actually adding a tax for infrastructure to the gas tax.
Well, that's different. It's different, but it's related. Here's what it boils down to. Because the cars and trucks we drive today are more fuel efficient, we burn fewer gallons of gasoline to go the same distance. And as a result, the revenue, federal revenue that pays for rebuilding and building new highways comes from this federal tax, and the money going into the Federal Highway Trust Fund has been going down because the number of gallons, it's a tax per gallon, the number of gallons has been going down. So if we're going to keep up with the construction, we've got to find a new revenue source. Here's what I've said. I am open, now that gasoline's down to a lower cost, I am open to a federal gas tax if we can find some tax relief, particularly for working families. For me, to fill up a tank is not going to be a big, important decision of the week. For somebody to fill up a pickup truck who is, basically living hand-to-mouth, paycheck to paycheck, the extra cost could be a real serious hardship. So what I've suggested is we couple an increase in the federal gas tax with protection for the incomes of working families. There are ways to do this. I think if we combine the two, that it's going to protect some of these folks.
Final one over here. Senator, what's your reaction to the president's veto of the Keystone bill?
I support the president's veto, and I voted yesterday against the override. The president has asked for the time to make the final decision on the environmental impact of this pipeline, and this preemption by Congress is unusual and I think unnecessary. Keep in mind, this is a pipeline owned by TransCanada, a Canadian company that wants to ship Canadian tar sands from Canada through the United States to a refinery in Texas. When we offered an amendment that said, and after they refine the product, it should be sold in the United States, it was defeated. This product's going to be exported. We also said, well, if we're going to build a pipeline here, let's use American steel to build the pipeline. That amendment was defeated. So the notion that this is a big job creator for us, ultimately, it does create jobs. I won't argue that point. But there are other ways to create jobs that make more sense. The Federal Highway Trust Bill is one.
How much more review time does there need to be?
I don't know. I don't know what the president, but I think it should be on a timely basis, and I don't think we ought to preempt the president's authority.
All right, we're going to leave it there.
All right, thanks everybody. I'll stick around if you have any other questions. Terry, thanks.
Okay.
Good to see you. Mike, thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.